Hey, ladies and gentlemen, we're not going to go through the normal rigmarole because it's a little bit different video, but it's about what I consider a public health crisis. But before we get into it, I'd like to have everybody keep in mind the family of Officer William Billy Evans of the Capitol Police Department. He gave his life unselfishly in the latest attack on the Capitol, and he was an 18-year veteran of that police force. He was a member of their first responder unit, which is considered their VIP protection. And he unselfishly sacrificed himself to ensure others were safe. His family is in my prayers, and I'd ask that you do the same. Moving forward into what I consider one of the biggest public health crises we face, it's in the area of mental health. And it does come into play in this story in a lot of ways. And that's why I refuse to compare this attack on the Capitol to others, because this is one individual who, if you go back through some of the stories, you can kind of put together a picture. And I am not a psychologist, I am not a psychiatrist, and I'm not board certified in any of those areas. But I know based on some experiences I've had dealing with people in the prison and even with some in the military that have come across some issues, there's some parts of this I want to talk about. Okay. In this article, they're talking about investigators are increasingly focused on Green's mental health. Now, in some articles, they talk about how he was visiting and espousing the beliefs of the Nation of Islam. Well, I'm not going to point a finger at the Nation of Islam and say they're responsible for this because there's nothing that shows that they are. In fact, there's a couple articles that talk about how maybe his belief in following their beliefs kept him from having a break. Now, one thing I didn't see it stated in this article, but I found it somewhere else, so I'm going to read it to you. Now, his social media, as is the latest standard with various social media outlets, once somebody has been identified as committing one of these crimes, all of their profiles are immediately taken down. And I am not knocking social media for that. I completely agree with it. And that stuff is still available for law enforcement investigators as they need it. But what I want to read to you was what I found in another article that he posted. The U.S. government is the number one enemy of black people. And he posted that in one video. Another post on his Instagram account last week, he believed Farrakhan had saved him. After the terrible afflictions I have suffered, presumably by the CIA and FBI, government agencies of the United States of America. Green wrote that he had left his job partially due to afflictions, but ultimately in search of a spiritual journey. He also added he had been suffering side effects of drugs I was intaking unknowingly, and those purportedly had been given to him by the CIA and the FBI. Now, what I will say about this is, obviously, he was going through some type of break. There's other articles that talk about the concern that his family and friends have had over the last few years. But even if you're concerned about your loved one, there's only so much you can do. And even if you put the effort forth, is there availability for mental health care for them to actually take advantage of it? In many cases, there's not. So you end up in a situation such as this where you have someone who's a victim or someone who's actually actively needing help, but there's either no help available or people don't know how to do not understand how to go about getting them the help. Once again, I'm not a mental health professional by any means, but I also know from dealing with offenders that have schizophrenic breaks or schizophrenic tendencies, which is what I see in those writings, thinking that he's being watched and controlled and drugged by the FBI and the CIA. I mean, there's other things out there affecting him, and he's on as he said, a spiritual journey, which is where he discovered the Nation of Islam. And maybe some of those experts were right. Maybe that did stop him from moving farther with it. The problem is there's a lack of mental health care available, and there's a lack of knowledge of how to get that mental health care for your loved ones if something happens. So how do we fix this system? I don't have a perfect answer. I know the answer that I've brought up before with fully funding effective mental health care programs, I do think is important. I think statistically speaking, if you look at the incarceration rates, the number of people incarcerated with legitimate mental health issues, either through genetics or through drug induced psychosis, is something that really needs to be looked at because we're not funding these programs and we're not doing anybody any favors because ultimately the two officers involved in this, one hospitalized, one was killed in the line of duty. Officer Evans died, and he was also a victim of the lack of mental health care available in this country. There were concerns expressed by his family, but there was nothing they could do about it. And even if they knew how to go about it, was the care available? I highly doubt it based on where we're at with funding for mental health. And that's police overall are generally the first responders when it comes to an emotionally disturbed person. And in this case, there's nothing they could have done differently from what you see in the video than what happened. This man actively attempted, as far as we know, to commit suicide by cop. That is the template of what he did. He expressed through social media where the break was coming. He drove his car into a fence and he got out with a knife and charged two police officers. And the other part of this that nobody ever talks about, we have the mental health of the individual involved that's not being addressed. So these tragic incidents happen, and that's what it is. It's a tragedy all around. This is a situation in which there's no winners. The family of Officer Evans, the family of the perpetrator, and the surviving officer who still got to live with what happened and will hopefully receive the mental health help he needs if he needs it to fully heal with the situation that went on. And I really think where our issue is coming in, there is no holistic approach to mental health in this country on any level. And we're not doing anything to make it better. So as a silent majority, this is another one of those issues where we have to start standing up and demanding that our country does something about it. We have a government that talks about how they want to do all these things. And I could pull up the article and I will say to our congressional leaders, thank you for coming out and addressing the bravery of this officer and addressing this as a tragedy. But let's not politicize what this is. Let's not start trying to compare apples to oranges to what happened prior to this incident because they're two completely different things. One individual on a psychotic break is not the same as a group of people doing something. And by trying to conflate the two, we muddy the waters where we could actually take this and say, okay, this is the final nail in the coffin of we're not going to fund these programs because these programs need to be funded. They can't be effective if they're not funded. So as a silent majority, it's time for us to stand up. It's time for us to use our voice on social media. You have it. All these social media accounts are free. You can stand up and start demanding government officials start providing the funding for effective mental health programs. We need them. The average person, the average family needs to know where to go where they can get help with this when they need it. Ultimately, people are dying where they don't have to because we are not treating them. We're not addressing underlying issues that are leading to the problems we're having. So please, let's step up and let's do the right thing with this. And let's hold our government's officials' feet to the fire. I got these great programs they're trying to do, but honestly, this is a very important one that's been blown off for more decades than I can count. And it's time to try to fix it. And in fixing this, we can save lives. We can reduce recidivism and ultimately save money in the end. And we can prevent these tragedies from happening in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you have a good evening. Keep the family of Officer Evans in your mind. Please, his family is in my thoughts and my prayers. That's all I have. Everybody have a good evening.